Hey, I think we're at time, so let's get this thing going, huh? Thanks everybody for coming. Really appreciate your interest in democracy, danger, and data. I'm going to jump right into it. I'm going to let you know there's going to be some green slides where I'm going to prompt y'all to maybe throw some things out, share some thoughts throughout the conversation. So, bring your thinking cap. Hopefully you've brought some thoughts into and assumptions into this talk, and we'd love to hear from you throughout, as well as hopefully we'll have a little time at the end to do some discussion as well. So let me get into it. I am Jesse Mortenson. I am CTO with a company called Plural. I live here in Minnesota, live in Minneapolis. I also have a history of knocking on doors, doing some political stuff, although always pretty much as a volunteer. Professionally, I do technology. That's my background is in mostly applications, web applications, some DevOps, et cetera. So now I am CTO at Plural, have been with the company for about 5 years. And let me introduce, or allow my colleague to introduce himself. Obinna, go right ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. Great to be here. My name is Obinna Osisiogo. I'm from Nigeria. I originally started as a lawyer and then went into the civic advocacy space, founded a nonprofit, led it for some years, and now I am VP for Africa at Plural.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If you don't know the name Plural, no problem. We're new-ish. We just rebranded, though. You might know us by our old name, Civic Eagle. The company had been Civic Eagle for like 6 years or something up to that point. So also, pretty small and new, but you might have heard of us as Civic Eagle. And I'm going to start with the thing that's exciting, probably in the exciting as in may you live in exciting times meaning of exciting, which is the danger. So you all saw the topic of the talk, which is that I think there are some dangers we face as a democracy, or democracies around the world are facing dangers. And I'm wondering if anybody feels comfortable throwing a hand up if you had thoughts about like what comes to mind when you think democracy is in danger. Like what's a thing that you think of in that category? A little louder. The insurrection on January 6th. That makes sense. Anybody else? Right here.
The recent elections on Nigeria and family over there.
Okay, you've got a connection to Nigeria. That's right. We're going to get into some of that for sure. Anybody else?
Purging of voter rolls.
Say more about that.
Deciding who can vote based on arbitrary rules and preventing people from voting.
Absolutely. I saw one more hand, and I'll get into
social media bubbles.
Social media bubbles. Say a little more about that.
Essentially, you're hearing the same viewpoint, and it's just you're not hearing differing viewpoints.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you all for sharing. That's definitely all stuff that we're thinking about. And I want to kind of like go a little bit zoomed farther out and hit a couple themes that, in our startup, like these are some of the big questions that we're trying to grapple with, the things that are kind of like, even with our own work, the stuff that we're really excited about, are questions that still that keep me up at night. I don't know if you're in a tech space, this question, like what keeps you up at night is a little bit of a convention. I see that, well, what keeps me up at night are some of these questions, as excited about my work as I am. And one of these is this fear that democracy is not inevitable, or sort of the ability to look at history and say, well, this thing that we have, maybe we take it for granted here in the US. And this is something that another colleague of Obinna and I's, Santiago, our data scientist, shared when I was first getting to know him, which is like, he's seeing the international press about the US, and he's sharing stories about where he lives in Colombia. And he's like, it could be a lot worse. And I see things happening in the US that make me very worried that you could be headed in that direction of things being a lot worse in your own country. What did I do? What did I do? Did I just sleep it? Okay.
Yep, good.
I'm good. Yep. All right, that's good enough. We're not in presenter mode, but that's okay. So even our own history in the US, I just want to put it out there that we haven't really been in democracy that long. People talk about a country being young. As a true democracy where really everybody has a chance to vote, at least formally, it really hasn't been that long. And I'm going to say the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is maybe the best thing we could peg at. Like, when is the U.S. like a real democracy even just formally. And I really love the author Adam Serwer, who I think is super smart about this stuff. Go check his work out if you're interested in this area. What he says is true democracy in America is a young, fragile experiment that must be defended if it is to endure. And I think that's really true. And we don't have to look very far in our history to say, like, well, if the Voting Rights Act was the point where we can say, all right, everybody in this country can really has a decent chance of voting now, that very same act has been gutted by the Supreme Court in the last decade. I hope this timeline isn't accurate, right? I don't want to look back 10 or 20 years from now and say, okay, like true democracy existed in the U.S. between 1965 and 2013 when the Shelby versus Holder decision happened. But I don't know. I can't predict the future. I'm worried about that. And I wanted to especially like to collaborate with Obinna on this presentation because again, that core insight of like, you know, I live here in the U.S., a very U.S.-centric position, but it is a big blind spot to just have that U.S.-centric position. And Santiago's insight is really important to me. So, Obinna, please tell us some of the same story in Nigeria.
Oh yeah, so I always find it very interesting when you know, my colleagues in America say democracy is fragile, and I'm like, if you have practiced democracy for over 200 years, Nigeria has a very checkered history, a short checkered history of democratic practice. We only started in 1963, which is just about 40 years there or so, and it's been checkered with military coups. And so we've had, when you look at the slide and you see the First Republic, Second Republic, Third Republic, Fourth Republic, those republics represents the periods where we've had democracy. Everything in between has been series of military coups and military administrations. And so our democratic practices is really young, is really fledgling, and is really and genuinely fragile. And I just wanted to paint a context that will be relevant further on in the conversation, that typically when you have the military administrations execute their coup, one of the first orders of business is to suspend the legislature or the parliament, because the parliament is the fulcrum of democracy. It's actually the one institution in the democratic setup where there's a plurality of voices and the debate happens and everybody sort of is able to get represented. And so that is really where democracy happens. So first order of business, they suspend the legislature and go on to make decrees unilaterally and all of that. And I will explain why this is really important further down the presentation.
Awesome, thank you. So second thing that keeps me up at night, let's say you've got a democracy. Even under democracy, transparency doesn't appear to be an inevitable outcome of that state of having a democracy, formally in practice. And we know at Plural, we know a little bit about transparency and democracy. If you saw my colleagues talk this morning, you saw some of the details of how hard it is. We run a project called Open States, which is the oldest and best source of U.S. legislative data. It's open data that you can go and get right now if you want to do research on legislation, patterns of legislation in the country. We did not start this project. This project started in 2009. We adopted it later on, but it's a very cool project that is the best source for open data on what's happening in policy. We got millions of people engaging with it, whether just like looking up who represents them to Googling a certain bill they heard in the news. That's all stuff that we have at openstates.org. We also have an API, structured data offerings that allow really, really cool groups who are doing important democracy work, some you see on this slide, to do their own research, to do their own analysis, to then make the pitch back to the public, to their constituencies about these issues. And in that project, right, in our own little tiny facet of it, like we've seen the Open States project survive like with and without resources. Like sometimes it's had funding, sometimes it hasn't. We adopted the project in 2021. So like since then, we've had a pretty good source of like resources and people and talent focused on it. But it's been a real struggle, and without like really like one or two people at various points in this timeline, the project wouldn't exist any longer, and it isn't obvious that anybody would replace it. Also, when we look through this project at the infrastructure of getting data about democracy itself, like in a lot of these cases, it's been 14 years and nothing has changed at the state legislative level in terms of data, transparency, access. Literally, if you go to the Wayback Machine and look at the Illinois General Assembly page from 2009 when the project started, it's exactly the same technology. And I'm not really picking on Illinois because we can still work with it, right? It's really not the worst example, but it is an example where there isn't an institutional incentive within, at least in the United States, within these institutions to move towards transparency or any kind of standard of data, right? So it's all these years later, and we still don't have any kind of standard data format, although the project has tried, right? Like at various points, Open States has tried to push in certain states to say, hey, wouldn't it be cool to have a legislative directive to get some kind of structured open data format? And those projects did not work. So that's one of the things that keeps me up at night, right? Is like things have not gotten better over the course of Open States, even though it seems like a clear need in the market and for the public good. So some of these things are actually getting worse. But yeah, take us to the Nigeria perspective again, Obinna.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Jesse. I did mention earlier that because of the various interregnums of military administration, where they suspend the parliament, what we've seen in Nigeria is that we have an entire generation of citizens who do not see, intrinsically, do not see the value of a parliament because they've been used to years of government existing without that floor for debating. And so you have questions like, who are these people? Why do we spend a lot of money paying them salaries? Why do we spend a lot of money funding the legislature? Are they really necessary? And then so there's a lack of trust, one, and then there's a sort of an inability to see the real value of the legislature in the democratic dispensation. And so these are some of the challenges that we have had. And I provide this context based on my experience as a civic actor before joining Plural. Now, so a lot of the work that we did was to try and increase public trust in the legislature. And as you can imagine, transparency is a very vital part of that happening. One of the problems that we have in Nigeria, as in most African countries, is that the policymaking data, right, is not readily available. It's not digitally available. And so people don't have access to this data, and the legislature and most policymaking bodies function and operate in obscurity. And then even in instances where this data is available, they are very fragmented, meaning that they are scattered over the place. They're not siloed in, in one repository to make access easy. And I think it's important to provide further context as well of the situation. So when you look at the first point, which is internet shutdowns, throughout the history of this Fourth Republic in Nigeria, there has been several attempts at shutting down the internet or as a way to restrict or to stifle freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and the fundamental rights to privacy and all of that. And I'll explain why this is important to note in the next slide. But the second point is policy-making data, like I mentioned earlier, has not been digitally available, And one instance I like to paint is the Electoral Act Amendment Bill. Somebody in the audience talked about Nigeria's election, recent elections being a clear demonstration of how fragile our democracy is. It will interest you to know that about 9 years prior to 2022, a lot of civil society actors were working to amend the Electoral Act to sort of improve the framework for conducting elections in Nigeria by introducing technology and other measures to, make the process transparent. Now, this initiative received a lot of pushback from the political class, the establishment, the typical political operators. And one of the things that we saw at the cusp of the bill finally being passed is that at a certain point in time, there were about 11 to 12 different versions of that Electoral Act Amendment Bill flying around. Nobody in the world knew which was the accurate version. The Speaker did not know, the Senate President didn't know which was the correct version. The members of Parliament, the senators, were not sure which was the correct version of the Electoral Act Bill. Civil society nobody in the country was sure, and it was a very chaotic moment. And that was the moment when I really started thinking about how do we use technology to prevent an occurrence of this. And that led me down a rabbit hole and eventually ended in my joining Plural. The second bill instance is the social media bill in bracket S. And it's in bracket S because, like I mentioned earlier, the government had tried various ways to stifle freedom of speech, freedom of expression, right to privacy, and all those things, right? And one of the ways they tried to do it is through several versions of a social media bill. And the interesting thing about it is that these bills almost made it through. There were several of them, as you see in the next slide. Jesse, if you could please move to the next slide, great. So here you see a timeline of attempts to stifle free speech, especially in the digital domain. And so in 2015, 2018, 2019, various versions of what we call the social media bill, most of these bills actually made it through. And that happened because they were moving through the legislative process without the knowledge of Nigerian citizens. Even civil society did not know until it was almost too late, and because of that, the advocacy, that was conducted by citizens and civil society to push back on these bills were almost a failure, and that's one point. So the citizens didn't know that these bills existed. The second point is that the citizens probably didn't know that these bills existed because in those bills, those bills sort of purported to deal with a different issue, but then certain sections in it, were the jokers. There were just a few lines of, of legislation that were the jokers. That was the actual purport of the bill that was actually intended to stifle free speech and, right to privacy. And so what happened is that, because these bills almost made it through, it became really clear to myself and most civil society actors that a lot of work needed to be done to prevent this from happening, to make sure that there was transparency in the legislative process, in the policy-making process, that citizens were able to know what was going on from the very get-go and, be able to have a say and contribution in that process. And I think that is what, that's some of the value that the technology at Plural has offered, and is offering to the work in Nigeria and Africa.
Awesome, thank you. Great stuff. For more perspective, and I want to now switch into the data frame. All right, so we've gone over some of the dangers that democracies face. Is data going to help us? And I want to just start by asking maybe a show of hands to satisfy my personal curiosity. Like, put your hand up if you feel like you've encountered some kind of data or like data-based reporting that has changed your mind on a public policy issue, like some kind of issue, proposal, maybe a candidate. Like, let's see, hands up if you feel like you've, okay, so it's half the room-ish. That's interesting, right? That's a little more hopeful than maybe I thought. Anybody with a great example that when I ask that question, like something comes to mind, you're like, yes, this is the thing that changed my mind about something. I got one hand.
Creator, data producer. So sometimes with statistics, especially crime data, where the administration may be saying something, but the data says something else, and based on like spatial variation. So it's like a manipulation of statistics. So you need an alternative viewpoint with data to sometimes create a different narrative.
Yes, an example of like crime data across spatial dimension. Anybody else with an example like that? Go ahead in the middle.
A little bit different, but like I was looking at the budgetary reports from my city for like the last several years, trying to understand some patterns. And going through that, like it became apparent to me like there was a systemic shortfall in the budget that was traced back to legislative decisions that were made 15 to 20 years ago. And like projecting for inflation, there was routinely like a $50 million annual shortfall systemically because of that. And like knowing that, like it traces back to that, and like it led me against like other, like measures that were being proposed to like acquire that funding to try and bridge that gap. And yeah, like up until like going in and trying to find those reports, I was missing that context.
Yeah, great example of you dug into some numbers and maybe found some budgetary stuff that maybe the politicians aren't so eager to talk about, perhaps. I'm going to keep it moving just for time, and we'll have more time to hopefully discuss at the end. This is another thing that keeps me up at night, the fear that data does not inevitably produce truth. And I think we've seen some pretty high profile examples of this. Something that's not even like data, it's just datum, right? There's just a fact that seems so obviously accessible, and like there's a way you go and track this fact down, and then it blows up this whole narrative that people are pushing. And I think the Obama birtherism conspiracy is a great example of that. Like there's simply a document or in a set of personal history and documents associated with a personal history that refutes this narrative. And yet it became not just a fringe thing from a weird celebrity, but a thing that a weird celebrity wrote into a great amount of power, and a thing that the mainstream picked up, right? And so this is such easily refutable by the facts, right? And I think most people's who are looking at this critically mind, and yet there's a lot of power that the fact of even just one fact, even one datum, did not inevitably produce truth. And of course, take that even further into, I don't know if everybody saw, but somebody took this guy up on his challenge, and an arbitration board is trying to award this guy $5 million against Mike Lindell, which, good luck, buddy. I hope you get it. Right? Like now you've got an organized political effort to say, hey, we have the data and it proves our thing. When even like a close practitioner look at it, everything is just like sand falling through your fingers at best. And somebody mentioned January 6th, certainly all of the election denial. But I want to take it, I don't want to just like point far away and way out there. For me, like I live in Minneapolis, and so the issues and political processes around discourse of crime and policing are really important to me. It's something where I, in my personal time, have put a lot of work to try to impact in my own small way. And one of the things that gets me really angry is that there's people out there selling this narrative that like the place I live is a large dystopian wasteland, which again, like I think facts on the ground, I can walk through my neighborhood. Like I know the parts that are hard and the parts that are easy, and I know that nothing amounts to a dystopian wasteland. So how do we get there? What's going on around data that allows this to happen? Well, one thing I just want to say, like we collectively decline to keep good data on violence, harm, and policing. So it makes these conversations really hard, even if we want to have a data frame, right? So very recently, only 63% of the nation's law enforcement agencies are submitting data to the national database on crime and on policing, which is just wild to me, right? Like we have so much headlines, so much attention, so much heat to this issue, and yet fundamentally as a society, we collectively choose not to create data about it. So very cool projects like Mapping Police Violence spring up to try to fill that gap. By the way, police killings are up since 2020, not down. Legislative initiatives that forbid public interest institutions of our government from collecting data, from doing research. Even let's go back to me caring about this issue, right? So I sent an email to an office of the city of Minneapolis, somebody I'd been introduced to, and I said, hey, like I'm just looking to answer some broad questions about what is our policing budget produce, right? Like what are the flows, right? If we have 911 calls going in and patrols going in, like what come out? What kind of contacts and arrests or convictions come out of that kind of thing, which I think is like a fairly value neutral sort of inquiry. But I didn't get any data back. Now I'm just one person, a lot going on that year. So not that mad that I got ignored, but it's also not too hard to imagine there might've been some political pressure to say, well, that's data we don't want out there. Oh, I did it again where I hit whatever that button was next to my space bar. But let's keep digging into that. So truth is not inevitable. Even just perceptions of what's the problem. This big distinction between a perception of is crime increasing in the community versus is there a threat in my area? This is Minnesota poll. So this is Minnesota data, but there's a big difference between that, right? And like what's going on there? Like clearly there's either not a data conversation or it's very disconnected one from the other. At the national level, this is also holds true. Much larger perception of crime out there nationally than perception of, oh, I am actually at threat of some kind of criminal action in my specific area. And again, I don't want to put any of this up there to dismiss real concerns, because there is real harm going on that affects a lot of people in the community, right? So I'm not trying to dismiss the harm that exists, but I do want to call out this interesting disconnect. And if we zoom back again, like the national picture is, yeah, there definitely were spikes in certain types of violent crime, 2020, 2021, compared to previous years, but also in the context of where things have been. The data doesn't show us this like, oh my gosh, like the world is the worst ever kind of picture. So it's something that has really troubled me. The fact that like, okay, we got a lot of headlines about this issue, but the data situation is not good, and if anything, it's getting worse. Crime is perceived as a huge problem, but not in my area. I did a lot of door knocking in 2021, and I heard a lot of people blaming, the defund movement, blaming the city council for things, but violent crime rose across the country in most states, across cities, suburbs, rural areas in 2020, 2021. In Minneapolis, like we never actually defunded the police budget, right? So again, like the facts of it didn't see, as I'm having conversations door to door, the facts of it don't seem to matter. So that's something that keeps me up at night. This is a quote from the Brennan Center. It just says, hey, if you actually look deep into the data, like it makes it really hard to pin on a specific like local initiative or local this or that. Like it seems like there are broad trends that affected the entire country in the last few years. And they're really like the data is important to get at some of those, and I don't see a lot of people doing it. So that's something that I worry about a lot. Okay, that's some of my U.S. perspective. Obinna, you want to jump in again?
Yeah, sure. And so this is a troubling issue, right? The fact that truth is not inevitable. I mean, it would stand to reason that once you can make data visible and available, then everybody, all sides, can agree on the fundamental truths and then start from there to debate and all whatnot. But like we've seen in the US, around the world, truth is not inevitable. And it's the same thing in Nigeria. And I just want to point out a few instances that show this. And I think all of this underscores the need for more work and for operators to pretty much double down on making sure that the data continues to be available, so that the agents who are working to get everybody aligned on what is true have all the resources that they need to do that. But two instances I like to point out is the NSAS protests. I'm sure many of us might be aware of it. It was a protest that was on the scale of in Nigeria, that was on the scale of like the Black Lives Matter protest in Nigeria, in the US. Interestingly, that protest was young people protesting. It started off as young people protesting against police brutality and extortion. And it metamorphosed into a protest against bad governance generally, lack of accountability and the systemic corruption in the political establishment. And something happened. That protest carried on for a number of days. And on the night of October 20 in 2020, young protesters were protesting under a bridge, under a toll gate, the Lekki toll gate. And for some reason, military men were sort of unleashed on the protesters that night, and they opened fire on the protesters and people died. Now, what happened is that despite the fact that Nigerians and the rest of the world who were tuned in following the protests saw this happening on Instagram, on IG live feeds, we all saw pictures of what happened. We saw videos of what happened, and there was general conversation and buzz on Twitter during that period in question. What we saw is that by the next morning, the government kicked into motion an apparatus, a propaganda machinery, to spin the narrative and change the narrative. And then the narrative that they started pushing is that nobody was killed, and that the military did not open fire on protesters. And they pushed this narrative so fiercely and so well that, it was a textbook case of gaslighting the public. So we started to see the country divided into two. People who believe that people died on that night, and people who believe that people did not die on that night. Now, the interesting thing and why I highlight this is that a number of young people came together and built a website where they provided a timeline of events that leading up to that, Lekki Tollgate massacre, like we like to call it. And that timeline had evidence for every point in the timeline. There was pictorial, video evidence, and all whatnot kind of evidence to prove that these are things that actually took place during this protest. And so that is data that was there, right? Which to any reasonable person points to the conclusion that people were killed on the night of that protest. But then, like I said, truth is not inevitable. Despite the data being in the face of everybody, the gaslighting was so robust that a bulk of the population do not believe that people died in that protest, and that sort of whittled down the efficacy of that civic demonstration. The other thing I wanted to point out is a number of years ago, sometime in the 1970s, we had a civil war. There was a war between the southeast region of the country who wanted to secede, who were asking for their own independence from the Nigerian states, the Igbo people, which incidentally I'm from, and we lost that war. But what happened is the winners or the victors rather, the political establishment following that war pushed the narrative that sort of painted this region in a horrible light, and in a way that continues to foster the oppression of the people of the southeastern Nigeria. And if you follow the Nigerian elections that happened recently, you'll see that narrative was pinned back up. Incidentally, the popular candidate for the presidency in Nigeria is from the southeastern extraction. And so in order to, as a political strategy or whatever, propaganda, they spun that narrative back up, and it's triggered ethnic bigotry and violence in the elections along ethnic lines. And so what we had is that political talks were deployed to prevent Southeasterners from voting, because they wanted to prevent them from voting, the candidate who was obviously from their own region. And these are some of the instances where, despite the existence of facts, propaganda and misinformation continues to thrive.
Thank you, Obinna. All right, I'm gonna skip past my prompt here because I know we're running a little short on time. But let's get to talking about democracy and what we think we can build that might help some of these problems that keep me from getting sleep. So we're with Plural. We're a startup in the democracy space, and I just want to share really quickly, what are we trying to do in this space that might help, and see what y'all think, right? So here's our CEO and COO, two of our co-founders, Mo and Yemi. We're now a 33-person company. We're a remote-first company. We've got people in the U.S., Nigeria, Colombia, as I mentioned. We're VC-backed, along with the Techstars program. Some of our financial backers. And this is part of our vision that I want to zero in, right? This is part of our official mission document, which is we envision creating a new interface where data and people drive the future of public policy. Sounds good, certainly inspiring to me. And yet, these hard questions that we've just gone through, they kind of bedevil the possibility of this, right? Can we imagine an interface where data and people drive the future of public policy when we see that, this is off in the future? Are we going to still have a practical democracy? Are we still going to have truth-seeking practices? Are those truth-seeking practices going to matter? Is the data going to matter, right? So all of these stuff forms the questions that we try to both do this work and also grapple with at the same time. So for ourselves, right, what we're trying to do in this space, it's a lot of work in the trenches, right? We're not building something that's going to magically solve one day these kind of big problems. But you're seeing here the Git commit graph of the Open State Scrapers repository over, since its inception. It's a lot of work just to do the basics of making legislative data transparent and accessible in an open way that allows other people to do the innovation, do interventions in the public sphere that actually matter, right? So part of what we're doing is a lot of work in the trenches, and we're trying to build a business that sustains that work. Mentioned in the earlier slide that well, for a lot of times, open states didn't have a lot of funding. You can see some lean commit years in here. Those weren't good years for democracy necessarily. Probably less hands on the project. And the way that we're trying to do this is through basically like building this open data core model where we are providing this foundational layer of civic data that we think should be everyone's right in a democracy to access. And we're providing that as free open data. That's the legacy of the Open States project that we're trying to carry forward. So there's a lot of data in there. But how do we build a business around that? Well, one, we have public democracy tools, and it's a thing we're going to be working on a lot this summer is to like make that even better under the Plural brand. Is like we are trying to provide tools for the people who are out there in the public doing the public part of this conversation and these conversations around public policy. So free find your legislatures, free find track your bills, et cetera. We got a lot of people engaging with that, as I said earlier. And we're also building like, okay, here's where the money part comes in, right? We also have features that we're offering software as a service. If you've got a professional policy team, you've got a government relations team, you basically have a budget and a team and you're working on legislation, public policy, like we want to talk to you because we think we have a really compelling suite of tools that helps you save time, get to the business of getting your voice in the process, getting your constituents' voice in the process as fast as possible. We're also doing advanced data insights, data science work on top of this open data set to try to like, if you are working at that scale, you're working at the national scale, you're trying to analyze a lot of legislation, like we think we have really good solutions for you. Some of our customers, right? So this is how we're paying the bills for this kind of work. And sometimes I take a step back and look in the mirror and I'm like, man, I love what I do. This is really great, noble stuff, but also like, how incremental is it, right? Like in the face of these big questions, like, are we ever going to get there? I mentioned that the transparency, even in this data set, has not gotten better from governmental sources over all those years. So I want to point to just a few things, and hopefully we'll have a couple minutes at least to talk about what are the things that we point to on the horizon that lead us to think we might someday make a big change, not just incremental changes, or at least those incremental changes get somewhere about some of these big questions about data and democracy. So one of these that I found really inspiring, not necessarily a prescription that I would say, okay, we're going to go do this, but I found this book really fascinating. It's called Infomocracy. It takes a big swing at tackling some of these questions and imagining a society that's like after a bunch of turbulence that might have solved some of these problems. And it kind of posits the idea that maybe a startup, maybe some organizational entrepreneurial thing could create this like powerful global, search engine truth function, right? Like imagine Wikipedia, but like way more, like they're monitoring everything all the time and telling you like with great reliability what's actually happening, right? So a little bit of a, an imaginary thing, but also I think really fascinating, right? Is like what could be building blocks towards that kind of thing on the horizon. Wikipedia, that's an interesting thing. Like as much as the media have been politicized, I haven't heard that much people saying, oh, Wikipedia is a right wing or a left wing plot. That's an interesting thing to me. And I don't know, I don't know where that goes, but to me, that's interesting that it's kind of weathered it. News TikToks, right? Like there are new ways to tell stories that feel really authentic, which can be bad, can be good. I'm not on TikTok, but I see the Washington Post TikToks on Twitter, and I think they're very fun. So that's a recommendation. Machine translation of opaque text, right? Like this is something that we're working on. Like all of these processes they're old, they're archaic. There's just reams and reams of text. Obinna mentioned this case where you don't have anybody even understands what the right document is about an important piece of legislation. Can we imagine like some kind of truth-seeking automated process that helps people cut through that stuff quickly? And I also want to make a shout out for just like the distinction between fact checking and discovering or having literacy about how we generate truth. Right, like it's one thing to quote facts at someone, it's another thing to be able to say, here's the process, the kind of process that tends to arrive at truth more often than not, and are there ways that we can make that more obvious, more transparent, what the difference is between those processes. One other thing I want to share as like an interesting thing on the horizon, large language models, the GPTs of the world obviously are making quite a stir. And people are writing papers about this, and I think it's really interesting. So here's one essay that's saying like basically, look, we've already seen a paper about how large language models could help a corporation be their automated corporate lobbyist. But what if we think about artificial intelligent agents as our agents, right? Like this idea of an exocortex, like a brain outside of my brain that can go out in the world, like maybe learn about me, what I care about, the issues that matter to me, and go and figure out, like, in these arcane processes, what's happening that I might care about. Maybe even loop me back in and say, hey, like this is this decision, or this vote's coming up in a week. You want to click a yes or no thing on it, right? Maybe there's a way that we can use some of this new technology to not just like flood the zone with shit, but also like empower lots of people to genuinely engage in stuff happening in the zone. And that brings us to the future, which for which we're all responsible. At Plural, we're trying to do our little bit. I think we can make a big impact. But it's something that, you know, like if we agree that there's dangers to democracy, I hope we all take some level of ownership over that and look at some of the history that's gone into it, and how many like tiny contributions people have made in situations where there isn't a lot of hope or a clear answer at the end of the tunnel, and that nonetheless we're really important, really brought us to some of the good stuff we have today. And thinking about that vision, I want to ask you, Obinna, because you mentioned your work in the civic sphere brought you to the then Civic Eagle, now Plural vision. What were some of your thoughts about what's exciting about the future of our work together?
Yeah, I mean, what is exciting is that data is just going to be more visible. Just more eyes for citizens, more eyes for private sector interests, more eyes for civic society actors, and generally introducing more transparency into the political landscape. So I'm pretty excited about that work. The same situation we have in Nigeria is you know, what we see across the continent. It's only a handful of countries that actually, where their parliaments have a website that they are regularly updated with policy data, and that's South Africa, Zambia, and Kenya. The rest of the other countries, just like Nigeria, is the data is just up in the air, you know, and so that's what is exciting about, you know, the work that we're doing in Africa.
Thanks for sharing that. I was hoping we'd have closer to 10 minutes. We have 2 minutes at the very end here. If you have a question or a thought you want to share, I'm very happy to entertain them for at least 2 minutes here. Hold on. Yeah, you moved once before. Let's see if anybody else new wants to jump in. Anybody new? Okay, go ahead.
Why is the US not transparent? And the second part of this question would be, why is this politically solvent for them to be not transparent? So it should be one of those basic things. I want to be transparent with the citizens. Why are we not forcing that with our politicians to agree to something like this?
Yeah, so I heard, why is the US not transparent? Why is it politically feasible to be non-transparent? Very good questions. I don't have a quick and easy answer. I asked those questions myself. Anybody who does have a quick and easy answer to that, or a different question? Let me go to the back.
Money.
Money is the answer.
I mean, for a very tiny part of it, I used to work in information systems for the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. So I've got some experience with like the law enforcement attitude around data. And honestly, part of it is money, but like part of like a huge part, like a lot of the data entry is like actually done by law enforcement, and they just don't view it as their job. Fundamentally, they don't. So a lot of the time you just don't get good data entry because they don't want to be doing it. I mean, it's not necessarily like trying to hide anything specifically, although it can be, but yeah, it's a big part of it, honestly.
Yeah, what's the old saying? If don't blame malice if incompetence will do.
There you go. Exactly.
Somebody's razor. I don't remember whose. I think we have room for one last thought from anybody. Anyone want to take the floor? Obinna, any last thought from you?
Sorry, say that again.
I was just going to say, if you want to have the last word here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pretty much say that the work to, you know, for us in Africa, for instance, to save our democracy, that's something that everybody, all hands need to be on deck on. And I think the same applies to the US as well. The US, you know, more than ever before, seems very divided and fractured, you know, right in the middle. And so while Plural policy is working to solve, you know, data transparency issues around policy making, I think all hands need to be on deck to figure out other problems that need to be solved to improve democracy across the world, pretty much.
A great call to action. All hands on deck. Thank you, Obinna. Thanks for joining me and co-presenting. This was a little bit of an experiment. First time we gave this talk. So if you have any feedback afterwards, please come on up and chat with me.